Dzień dobry, cześć i czołem. Witam wszystkich bardzo serdecznie. Nazywam się Kaja Klimek, a my jesteśmy oczywiście na festiwalu, tu, z tej strony, Octopus Film Festival w Gdańsku. To już kolejny rok oglądania świetnych filmów w dziwacznych miejscach albo dziwacznych filmów w świetnych miejscach, ale to też czas, kiedy możemy porozmawiać z twórcami, możemy porozmawiać o ich twórczości, ale też o tym, co naprawdę kochają. I ja mam tę niebywałą okazję, żeby porozmawiać z australijskim reżyserem, który przybywa do nas na falach internetu z daleka, czyli Markiem Hartleyem, autorem filmu Niezupełnie Hollywood, który można było obejrzeć na festiwalu. To film o exploitation, czyli kinie australijskiej eksploatacji. Mark jest też autorem filmu o wytwórni Canon Films, o szalonych dziewicach z maczetami, tak by można było przetłumaczyć film Machete Maidens, i też jest autorem remake'u słynnego filmu Patrick. Więc mamy o czym porozmawiać. Ja się bardzo cieszę na tę rozmowę. Rozmowa oczywiście odbędzie się w języku angielskim. Pytania będą przeróżne. Mam nadzieję, że będzie to dla Was interesujące. Ja oczywiście ze swojej strony, jak zawsze, z głębi mojego fioletowego właściwie chyba serca, bo to ośmiornica jednak niech będzie, polecam wszystkim festiwal Octopus i filmy też z Velvet Spoon, które tutaj możemy oglądać. Także zapraszam na rozmowę z Markiem Hartleyem. Oh, hi Mark. Once again. So just a tiny test. I told you that there are not going to be any tests, but oh hi Mark, does it bring you any memories of any film? Maybe you recognize who says a lot, oh hi Mark, in a film? It's not a film from Australia. But I guess you maybe have seen the film called The Room by Tommy Wiseau, which is one of the modern classics.
Life is too short to sit through films like The Room, I figure.
Oh my God, so you shouldn't say that at Octopus Film Festival.
I probably invested my time watching a far either better or worse film than The Room.
The Room is one of the worst, actually, and if I could recommend you a film, I would definitely do that, because it's one of those golden gems that you can find in the history of cinema, and you as a kind of a historian of cinema too, would be more than entertained watching this. And Oh Hi Mark is one of the things that really is brought back a lot of times on the screen. One of the characters is Mark, the other one is Johnny, and they say Oh Hi Mark, Oh Hi Johnny all the time, basically. So that's why I brought this back. But oh hi Mark, it's nice to meet you, and I'm really glad on behalf of the festival that we have a chance to talk about your films. As you know, we screened Not Quite Hollywood, the untold and wild history of exploitation. And I wanted to focus on that, but also in general on the way you work with this matter as the cinema is when you make your films. But first, tell me, I would quote another thing. Everybody wants a piece of the action. It's actually a song from your other film, the one about Canon Films. But what kind of piece of the action you get from exploitation? That would be the thing that I wanted to ask first.
Sure. I guess with exploitation, you were sort of watching cinema without rules. These films were made very early on in the Australian film renaissance, where there were no rules. There was no health and safety. Filmmakers, there was no real, structure in terms of departments on films. Everyone sort of joined in and made the best film they possibly could in the time they had and the budget they had. So you're seeing films that were made with a lot of raw energy that maybe is a little bit lacking now from Australian films.
But wouldn't you say that it could be also lacking in other films? Because the wildness that we can see in many of those films is something super extraordinary, I would say. What's your thought about that? Because when you say like the cinema is lacking this now, what's behind that, if you can develop on this, because it's super interesting?
Sure. I think back then Australia was a very, small country away from the rest of the world. And obviously we spoke English, which was, a blessing and a curse for Australia, because we spoke English, we had to compete with other films that spoke English. and they were from much bigger countries with a much more established film industry. So we just had to do things to compete with them, which was all about making our films faster, crazier, more extreme, that they would catch the attention away from these other films and put a spotlight on them. So I think that's a large part of it. Us having to yell a whole lot louder to be heard.
And can you tell me, because probably you grew up a bit with those films, do you remember something that struck you the most when you were, young moviegoer, a person that is just starting to discover cinema, and suddenly you see something so wild? You would close your eyes, or rather it opened them up more? What were your first thoughts, if you remember that still?
Sure, I think it was. I always loved films, so I saw lots of films from America and lots of films growing up. When I saw the Australian films, the Australian exploitation films like Snapshot and Patrick, particularly, two films that were shot in my hometown town of Melbourne. What was really interesting, that I saw films that looked like American films, but they had locations that I recognized, they had accents that I recognized, and they spoke to me a little bit more because it seemed like we could compete. We could take on, the other films in the world and try to beat them at their own game. And it was sort of more of a personal experience watching them.
It's really interesting because as I come from Poland in the 90s, there was this huge wave of films that were kind of inspired by American cinema, by Hollywood cinema, but they were set in here, they were using the genre, but in the way that you were always like, okay, it seems to be like Die Hard, but it's made in Poland, so it's not really that spectacular with the, for example, special effects or the acting even, but at the same time, it's so close to the heart because you feel like it's about us in a general way. So that's what it reminds me of. But at the same time, when I was watching the film about exploitation, it struck me that there was kind of like a huge censorship on those films. Can you tell us a bit about that? Like, do you remember that films were actually like censored, the ones that you were watching also?
Sure. Well, I was too young. I mean, we in the 60s and the very early 70s. Australia had one of the most extreme censorship regimes in the world. Everything was cut. I mean, even when these films screened, we're talking about art house foreign films, when anything was screened at film festivals, they were even cut. And then in the very early 70s, we had the introduction of the R certificate, which meant that there was a new rating that people over the age of 18 could see these films. And so it meant that suddenly we went from being the most censored country in the world to being one of the most liberated. And that's really what encouraged the start of exploitation in a way. Australian audiences were so starved of seeing any kind of adult content on screen that when Australian filmmakers embraced that and made sex comedies early on, they made incredible amounts of money. Every single Australian who possibly could flocked to them, and more than once. So you had films that were being made for absolutely no money at all, that were making an absolute fortune, and 1 in 10 Australians were seeing them. Very similar, when I did Electric Boogaloo, it was very similar to what happened there with their Lemon Popsicle films, which were sort of R-rated teen movies, where they're still some of the highest grossing films in the history of Israeli cinema. And an amazing number of the population went and saw them. So we had a similar thing in Australia with films like Elvin Purple and Barry Mackenzie.
Yeah, it's again, everybody wants a piece of the action. And as you were saying, the people were so starved of some action, whatever that means, that it's the thing that you just really want to see on the screen. And I wanted also to talk a bit about the way you work with the film, because I watch a lot of films about films. All the fans of cinema do, because we want to know how films were made and what's the story behind them and all of that. Now even on Netflix we have this movies that made us kind of story that dwells into development of films like Dirty Dancing or Home Alone. So it's like mainstream of mainstream, but we want to know the story behind it. But to be honest, I've never seen films that start so fast. so rapidly, so that they throw you in the middle of something, and it's, you know, facts, as you made. So I wanted to ask you about the way you developed your style, because when I had a chance to watch Electric Boogaloo and Not Quite Hollywood, I discovered that, okay, that's the way the guy works, you know, like he puts me in the middle of it and people start talking the stories and anecdotes. So I wanted to ask about that. How did you develop this idea to give us this piece of the action right away?
I'd never made a documentary before Not Quite Hollywood. I'd made lots of music videos. So I was kind of used to, you know, squeezing in as much fast cutting in a music video in the 3 minutes as possible. But I think the pace for Not Quite Hollywood, it was more a fact that these films were so exciting that the last thing that we wanted the documentary to be was boring. But we also knew we had a limited amount of time, and it had taken so long to get this film financed, and it was so difficult to get financed because these were films that the Australian funding bodies weren't necessarily fond of. And certainly for us to get the budget for the film, it was never going to happen again to anyone. So if these stories weren't told in our documentary, they'd never be told. So it started off as a much longer cut, and we just kept on tightening it and tightening and squeezing and tightening it, because I just realized if the stories weren't there, they were never going to be told. So let's just squeeze as much information into it as possible. And I also like the idea of not just hearing the story from one person, from hearing it from lots of different people, all adding information to it. So, I mean, I have heard people say that watching Not Quite Hollywood is like being at a dinner party where you've got 12 people basically yelling at you all evening, and you come away hearing a story from 12 different perspectives.
Yeah, it's a bit
look,
like
I also figured,
I only wanted to say that we're talking at the same time. It's like a dinner party of two people. I just wanted to say it's like Robert Altman film, you know, that you are just out there with all those people and you don't know what is important because it seems everything is important. So that was just like a comment on that. Please continue.
I also figured that, look, these are the kinds of films where people are going to be taking notes to see which films they actually want to explore from the documentary. And if they're going to be doing that, they're going to be watching it more than once. So what they miss on the first time, they can pick up on the second time.
Yeah, it's a bit like I'm going to come back to this. It's a bit like a book, like an encyclopedia of something, I would say, and that's really useful. But we're going to come back to this a bit later. But when you have all those stories and all those interviews and all those materials, it's like a huge forest of things. And how do you find the way to not get lost in it? Because it feels that the movie could be like 7 hours long also, because there's so much material, and I can feel that those people were talking for hours, probably, some of them at least. So there are those archives of things that you still have, all those interviews, and it could be a TV series, and so on and so forth. We can imagine what else could be made out of this. But you need to, as a director, I imagine, have some rules for yourself, how to not get lost in all of this. So how do you structure this? Do you work with a screenplay, or do you work with those post-it notes, or what's the way to construct this mosaic? Is it chronology, or I don't know, like tell me. I'm super interested in that.
I had a screenplay which I sort of had researched from interviews that I'd done, and also lots of other interviews where I sort of pieced together the narrative of the film that I wanted to tell. And that was also great because it meant that I used that to write my question list from. So every question I asked people, I kind of knew to some degree the answer and what I wanted out of them. So I could keep on talking to them till I got the information that I needed to tell the story. It's interesting you mentioned the TV series. We had the sort of the future prospect of a TV series dangled in front of us. And I had a post-it note on the computer, on the edit suite, saying, when in doubt, save it for the television series. So we kind of always, we thought that we could always come back and expand on it. I guess the other thing was that I needed to be brutal about this. And so if we lost anything, I wouldn't fuss or worry about it. It was just gone, and we had to move on because we knew that we only had a certain amount of time And the other editors really couldn't believe how mercenary I was in terms of just losing material, because we ultimately we kept on refining it down to the best stories and to the best films that told the story. And I guess when we were looking at the interviewees, the footage, and we had 100 hours of interview material, it was all about who told that bit of information in the most concise way. And so we'd use that. I guess it was, the biggest challenge was the push and pull between information versus entertainment. Because we figured with the Australian films, a lot of them no one had ever seen or heard of. So we had to give some information about the films before we went into the funny stories about them. And when we did Electric Boogaloo, that was a little less like that, because we figured a lot more of the Electric Boogaloo stories, the canon films, people had seen. So we didn't really need to set up the films as much. We could just go straight into the stories behind them. But with Not Quite Hollywood, it was really setting up the whole history of Australia in the 70s, setting up the different genres, the sex films, the action films, the horror films, and then just letting the stories tell the rest of the story.
It
Letting
really
the funny stories tell the rest of the story.
Yeah, it really sounds like quite of a challenge, especially when you have so much stuff that you really want to talk about, because it feels that you really love this cinema, and it's difficult to say no to anybody. But tell me also, because if we talk about I'm really interested in the way films are made on this level. When you find your interviewees, the people that you talk with, probably there was a list of the names that should appear in the film, but you also want them to appear in the film. But at the same time, talking heads, it's always a challenge. How to make, two people talking on the screen in an interesting way, or one person talking about stuff. So what are your guidances when you put people on the screen and film them? Because I could see that some of the interviewees appear in pretty peculiar places. Some of them appear in regular places. So tell me a bit about that. What's your ideas behind it? And exactly, because so many filmmakers make it so dull, in my opinion, that you have really interesting person talking about interesting stuff, but the frame is so boring that it's just like it's lost. And with your film, it's not like that. So just tell me a bit about finding those ideas.
I guess, look, people are interesting. One thing we didn't speak about before is obviously another thing apart from the funny stories is that you have certain film clips, scenes in these films that you want to show. And it's also about getting people to talk about those so that you've got an excuse to show them. So it is about getting people to open up about crazy scenes. And with Not Quite Hollywood, it was really interesting because these films had been dismissed a lot, in Australia. But they were great training grounds for all the people involved. They were really keen to talk about them because they'd never had an opportunity to talk about them before. And none of them were embarrassed by them. They all held them quite close to their heart because they'd been their step up in the industry, had been their training ground, and it launched them onto bigger and better things. So I guess there was a lot of, people finally being able to tell tales that they'd always wanted to tell but had never had the opportunity. And they hadn't told them hundreds of times before. And maybe that's the reason why some of the interviewees were possibly a little bit more interesting to listen to than if they had told them 100 times before. In Not Quite Hollywood, there is a couple of we shoot one of the directors in a strip club. And that happened because there were 6 key filmmakers that this story was about. And the original idea was we would shoot each of them in their own environments. And for some reason or not, that didn't happen for a large majority of them. And we only ended up, I think, shooting John Lamond in the strip club. So he looked slightly out of place compared to everyone else. Then when we subsequently went to do the other documentaries, we realized how much time and effort it had spent to basically find different theaters, different locations for each of the interviewees, do individual lighting for all these people. It's taken a lot of time, and we just didn't have that time or money on the next project. So we just got them to go to a studio, put a black behind them, and shot them all one after the other in rapid succession. So I guess the interviewees don't look as interesting in the next two documentaries.
Yeah, but noticing this gentleman with the lady dancing behind him was something like I was pretty surprised. And of course, you know, when you watch a lot of documentaries, you see those kind of things that, oh, there's some effort if it comes to how you can interview somebody, and I always really appreciate that. That's why I wanted to ask about this. And you mentioned this. Yes, please.
I was going to say, I mean, we used in Electric Boogaloo, we used the black backgrounds to our advantage because it meant we could constantly putting up posters and text and newspaper headlines to keep telling information that would sort of allow us to get it shown via newspaper headlines or something instead of having to cut to newsreel footage or people telling that story itself. So we use that background to our advantage.
Yeah, of course. I wanted to ask, you started to talk about it, about the scenes and the footage that you use, which opens this, I always imagine archives as this vault or as this kind of super huge place in Riders of the Lost Ark, that there's, you know, the scene at the very end that the guy walks and there's like all those things hidden, and archives are something like that for me. I'm really interested in the way you can work with them and all those challenges that happen. But can you tell me a bit about the challenges that you came across? Because probably some of the films are somewhere hidden or lost in a way, you know, and that could be a challenge to get to them and really find the way to show them as the commentary for the interviewees or as the illustration. Did you come across any like super huge challenge that you felt like almost like Indiana Jones overcoming them when you had the chance to really get what you wanted from the archive?
With Not Quite Hollywood, we were really lucky in the fact that we have a National Film and Sound Archive in Australia, and they had a large majority of the materials. They had the original negatives. Because Australia had so few film labs, it was really easy for all that material to end up in an archive. There was a few things where we went scouring through filmmakers who had passed on their sort of their garages to find a few films that were difficult, that hadn't been archived, but we were really lucky in the fact that the original negatives were at the archive and we could get access to them and transfer these films so they looked as good as I ever had. I mean, that was something I said from the very start. I was so sick of seeing documentaries on filmmaking where they just used old, scratched trailers of the films to show you scenes from them. And I made a point of saying we want all the original scenes and we want to grade them and retransfer them to look as good as they ever have. Because no one will understand how what the filmmakers were trying to achieve unless they see these films the way they were meant to be seen.
Yeah, it's really important what you just said, like showing the films in the way they should be also shown, not like what you can find. And when you say that you were lucky, it seems like some films just want to be made. And that's one of those stories that there was a time, there was a place, and there was this moment that the untold story of exploitation wanted to be made. And I wanted to ask you about one particular interviewee that you have. You're not going to be surprised who I'm asking about, because that's also for the fans. Quentin Tarantino, described as a fan. I really love that moment, that it's not like the director of this and that, but just a fan. So can you tell me a bit about the energy that he brought to your film? And I can imagine that it wasn't that difficult at that time to maybe talk with him. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, look, we'd been trying to get this film financed for a very, very long time. And it looked like after about 6 or so years, it just wasn't going to happen. And I'd amassed a huge, like you asked before, a huge research document, which was basically the script of the documentary. And so I knew someone who'd worked with Tarantino and thought he'd be interested in reading it. So I just literally sent it to his assistant and said, look, Quentin might be interested in reading this. We've had a hard time getting this documentary made, but here he goes. And he got back to us very, very quickly saying, I've read your document from cover to cover. What can I do to help you get it financed? And so we thought the best thing to do was just to go and interview him. And then we knew that if we had that, we could shop that around and hopefully get some more interest in the project. And so that's what we did. We spent, I think we did about a 3-hour interview with Quentin, and he surprised me by knowing pretty much something about everything to do with Australian film. And yeah, it was also, it really helped us. It helped us get some international partners involved to do some pre-sales, which got the film financed. And it also helped lure some more of the harder to get interviewees in, when you could say, well, Quentin's, we've already interviewed him and this is what he had to say about you or your film. And so that sort of got them intrigued by the project as well. So it helped all around. And it was also really important in the story to have someone overseas who had seen these films. So there was some sense that they'd traveled beyond Australia and had found an audience beyond Australia as well. And he was the perfect fan to talk to.
Yeah, it's really great to have somebody that loves the stuff that you love and can help at the same time, because it really feels that he's one of these people that, you know, I've listened to so many podcasts that on some random podcast he talks about, oh, the way the day that I went to see Dunkirk by Christopher Nolan, and he talks about that for 2 hours, for example. And it feels that he always have time for this, because in this bottom of his heart, he's really a fan of cinema. So what else could he do if somebody wants to talk to him about the stuff that he loves the most? And I asked about him not only because of the fact that he's such a popular director and all of that, but also I'm really interested in the tension between, you know, being kind of a film scholar and being a film fan. Do you divide this kind of two worlds? Because your film seems to be a connection between those two things. We have a history of cinema, of course, wild and untold. And at the same time, we have this huge fan vibe that it comes from it. So how do you, what do you think, or how do you feel about those two worlds? Are they disconnected for you, or are they connected? Yeah, like that's basically the question.
Look, I consider myself a film fan. It's amazing, you know, lift up any rock and you'll find a film historian under them these days. I think film historians are a label that's bandied around a little bit too much these days. Anyone who's written a blog is suddenly a film historian. So, you know, I think I'm a film fan, and I think that, you know, I've contributed to hopefully spreading my love of certain parts of cinema.
Oh, that's it. That was the super short answer. But I'm gonna dig deeper. We have to go deeper, to quote my favorite Nolan again, because there is so many books about film, and for me, it sometimes feels that okay, you can show more and tell more when you make a film, or when you make, for example, like a YouTube video essay about something, that when you write about this. What do you think about this difference? That, you know, there could be a huge book about exploitation and there could be your film. So how do you approach those two ideas of telling the stories?
Well, I mean, my film, I guess, is like a good entry point to exploring more about exploitation. And ultimately, the films stand on their own. I mean, the good thing about seeing Not Quite Hollywood, for me, the most gratifying thing was that people said after they saw it, it encouraged them to watch films that we featured in the documentary. Now, there's only so much information we can squeeze into a 100-minute film. But, you know, obviously there are some incredible reference film books out there where, you know, it's everything you ever possibly wanted to know about different genres or different films or different styles of filmmaking. And a documentary can compete only in a visceral way by actually showing you material from that film, but it certainly can't compete in terms of the amount of information that you can squeeze into a really, really good reference book. And I grew up, you know, devouring film books. And for me, it was the 3 volumes of cult movies by Danny Peary. They were the ones that I just read from cover to cover over and over again. And it's funny when reading the amount of books I did on cult films and science fiction films and horror films, and just having the single stills from those books burnt into your brain. Sometimes the films never lived up to that single still that you saw in those film books.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Once, many years ago, I translated a book about Pinku Eiga from Japan, and we only knew some of the films through the descriptions of them and maybe one photo, because the footage doesn't exist anymore because the films were just destroyed. There were so many of them that you couldn't even, store them. There was no archive. So that's the story of a film that we kind of only have. So, screening the film in your head, it's sometimes even better than really having the chance to watch the film in the, parallel universe, I can think. It felt that you wanted to say something.
I know, I was just going to say, it's very different now. When I was growing up and, we had these film books, it wasn't like we could suddenly just go to a video library or suddenly go to a streaming service and instantly watch these things. If they weren't on your 3 channels of television late at night, you never saw them. So now it's very different reading reference books, knowing that 99% of the films you're reading about are at your fingertips. You can easily read about them and then literally go and find them and watch them. Back then, you literally read about them, and a lot of the times you figured that's as close as I'm ever going to get to seeing the films, that one still that's in that book.
Yeah, that's true. But the way to bring the films back and give them another life or give them to different age audiences is also remaking them. And you are also a director of a remake. So I wanted to ask you about Patrick and the idea behind remaking this super widely known film from exploitation. Can you tell us a bit about that? Because I feel that so many people here in Poland had no chance to watch it. So maybe that would be also the film that they're going to take a note from our conversation and maybe try to find it. Why did you, just to put it simply, why did you make a remake of Patrick?
Look, I'd been trying to get up a narrative feature for a long time, and they'd all fallen apart. And on Not Quite Hollywood, I met Tony Ganane, the producer of the original Patrick, and Justin King, who was the researcher on Not Quite Hollywood. At that point, every film that that had a beginning, middle, and end was getting remade by Hollywood. And we just pitched to Tony that Patrick would be a really interesting film to remake because the technology had improved so much from the original film in 1978 that it could be a very different film. And I also had the feeling that, you don't want to remake perfect films. There are some films that just should be left alone because they haven't dated and they are close to perfect. Patrick was a film that I really loved, but it certainly wasn't a perfect film. It wasn't a film that was revered by everyone and it should never be touched. And it was something that we thought we could do something very different with. So we pitched him an idea which was it was making a film even more old-fashioned than the original. Mm-hmm. It was trying to make it like a Hammer horror film in a way. And Tony liked the idea and he managed to get it financed. So we went ahead and made it. And it's interesting, not once on the set did I think that I was making someone else's film. We'd sort of put enough of ourselves in it that we really thought we were making our own movie.
Yeah, I really love to see that one because, of course, it's not available here, but maybe one day that's going to be possible. For example, Octopus Film Festival screening Patrick and Patrick, that would be something, because in here we are also really into this kind of reworks or comebacks to stuff that was made before. So, yeah, and it seems like a perfect idea, the way you described it. Yes, please.
I was saying in Australia, only last month, they brought out a Blu-ray here with both versions on it. So you can get a double Patrick Blu-ray with both films. So maybe they could find it via Amazon or eBay or something.
Yeah, really that's a really good news for us.
It's great to be able to see both of them side by side as well. And maybe you'll appreciate the remake a little bit more when you see how we've tried to, really pay homage to it, but make it a film that's its own entity.
Yeah, and it's gonna allow us to embrace the weirdness, which is like if you can embrace weirdness twice, it's better than embracing it once. That's always the thing. So I wanted to come back for a moment to making films about films. If you were asked by me now, what are the 3 ground rules for you when you make a film about film? What that would be?
I think you have to know the story you're telling, or at least have an idea of the storytelling before you do it. You have to never be boring,
Perfect.
and for me, it's all about having lots and lots and lots of interviewees. I think the more people on screen, the better. The more different stories you're going to get, the more variations of stories you're going to get, and the more overall, it's going to be more based in reality of what actually happened. I've seen so many documentaries lately where they talk to people who weren't even born when the films were being made. And it's, I just keep on thinking, why should your opinion mean something? I'd rather hear from the people who were there in the trenches fighting the battle to get this film made than someone who watched it or read about it in their 20s. So I think it's really important having, the third one would be having authentic voices in your documentary.
Perfect. I think it's really important for all the filmmakers that want to tell the story about cinema to remember the things that you just said. And I also wanted to ask you, because as we know, you are pretty busy working with a new film. Can you tell us a bit about this project that you're working on? Is it going to be something that we can maybe in the future see at Octopus Film Festival? Something for the fans of genre and craziness and wildness?
Hopefully, it's a thriller, once again produced by Tony Gdańsk, who produced Patrick and Turkey Shoot and lots of films on exploitation, and it stars Radha Mitchell, and it's a thriller about a young girl who thinks that the neighbour next door is a serial killer, and he also happens to be dating her mum, which is never a good thing. So that's the story in a nutshell.
I can see that somewhere in B90 or Drizzly Grizzly. That are the places that the films are screened here. Sometime in the future, maybe we're gonna have a chance to watch it. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for finding time for us. I'm gonna keep my fingers crossed, or just we catch our thumbs here in Poland to wish somebody luck. It's like a bit like this, but I know it's more popular like this, for your new project. And thank you for bringing us this wild and untold story of exploitation. I was taking notes, actually, and I know that many people did the same to discover this cinema through your story. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you. And look, it's great that you're able to run your retrospective, and hopefully that encourages people to dig a little bit deeper, because I'm sure they've only just scratched the surface of exploitation. And the good thing is that there are so many of these films now that are able to be watched and found and hopefully enjoyed.
And remade, maybe by you in the future, another one, maybe Turkey Shot that we watched last night or something else. I'm gonna keep my fingers crossed for that. Thank you once again, and maybe see you in the future. Say hi to Australia from us here in Gdańsk.
Thanks so much, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. No cóż, drodzy Państwo, drodzy fani dziwnego, nieopowiedzianego kina z Australii nie tylko, dziękuję bardzo za to, że spędziliście czas z nami. Dzisiaj ostatni dzień, bo dzisiaj to niedziela, dzisiaj ostatni dzień tegorocznej edycji festiwalu Octopus, w tym wspaniały seans ukryty, o którym nic nie wiem, więc jeśli jesteście w Gdańsku, to wpadajcie do nas i oglądajcie te rzeczy z nami. A my pewnie widzimy się w internecie, widzimy się na filmach. Dziękuję bardzo za to, że byliście tutaj i wszystkich bardzo, bardzo serdecznie pozdrawiam. Pa, pa.